Hello, today we're looking at Psalm 23, one of the most famous Psalms, probably one of the most famous passages of Scripture. We're looking at Psalm 23:1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now that's so common to us, but there are two things in there. One, very important to see, one is God's role as shepherd, Jehovah Rohi, and the other is God's role as provider, Jehovah Jireh. The reference to shepherd is from Psalm 21:3, Jehovah Rohi, the Lord is my shepherd. But Genesis 22:14 is the reference for God my provider. Now let's read that. Genesis 22:14 in the NIV, it says, "So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide." And the context of that story is when Abraham was offering Isaac, a ram was provided in the stead of his son, sacrificial word picture, of course, referencing Calvary, Jesus Christ dying for us. And he said, the Lord will provide. Now, this is very interesting, I thought. Provider, pro meaning before, and vider coming from video, or to see, provider, before, to see, before I actually see. So God is a provider for us. The Jehovah Jireh of God is a provision for us even before we actually see it, which I find to be very comforting. Now, again, I said Psalm 23, particularly this first verse, the Lord is my shepherd. It's so common. Let me offer a couple of things to help us maybe bust out of the commonality of this particular verse. First of all, if you read each word with emphasis, for example, the Lord is my shepherd. Not a bunch of other guys. The Lord. Or the Lord is my shepherd. What resonates in me when I think the Lord is my shepherd? I see his transcendence, and I see his strength and his power and his goodness. The Lord is my shepherd. God says, I am. The Lord is. I am that I am. The Lord is my shepherd. How about this? The Lord is my shepherd. You could pray that simple verse, emphasizing each one of those words, and feel the power of God sweep over you in a full way. The Lord is my shepherd. He's my redeemer. It just begins to roll out of us. And then the Lord is my shepherd. He cares for me. He watches me. He comforts me. He disciplines me. There's a famous story that I tell often. I've said it many times at CCC, but I'll say it again. There was a great orator that went to a city, and he quoted Keats and Shelley and Shakespeare, all the great writers. He quoted from the Scripture. And at the very end, he took requests. And the story goes that an old man stood up in the back, slightly hunched over, his frail hand lifted in the air, and his voice was broken by years in ministry. He said, "Sir, would you quote the 23rd Psalm?" And the orator said, "Sir, I will. If when I'm done, you'll quote the 23rd Psalm." The old minister nodded and sat back down. The man got up and he said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." On and on and on. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Thunderous applause. Ovation, standing ovation. Applause throughout the house. When it calmed down, the man said, "And now, sir, your turn." The man stood and he said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul." The man continued until he was finished with the psalm. And when he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the entire building. The minister was seated, and the orator looked around, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have touched your ears. He's touched your heart. And the difference is that I know the 23rd Psalm. He knows the shepherd." It always touches me. It almost brings me to tears every time I tell the story. As many times as I've told it, almost every time I tell the story, my eyes get misty. Now, there's a wonderful book about Psalm 23. And it's called The Shepherd's Look at the 23rd Psalm, written by a guy that was a shepherd, grew up that way. and writes about the angles of a shepherd. Now, there are two things that always stick in my mind. One is the shepherd would carefully comb through each sheep, put his hands on the sheep, feel if there was any extra warmth in any kind of area showing signs of infection. He would pull out all the burrs and any kind of tangled wool, and he'd touch the sheep and comb the sheep and care for the sheep. And then the other classic picture that strikes me is Jesus carrying a sheep over his shoulders. And I've often said, we think, wow, isn't that great? Well, actually what happened, it is great. But what happened is that sheep was one that would often stray. And whenever a sheep would stray, that shepherd crook would be used to break the leg of the sheep for its own good. And at that point, then, the shepherd would have to carry the sheep, nurture and care for the sheep, and would carry it around until it healed and was well. And that bonded place, plus the discipline, helped the sheep be safe in the future and grow. There's a scripture, I think I'm going to read it, let's see. I believe it's in the King James. John chapter 10, verse 4 and 5 talk about the shepherd. Jesus says, "And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice." Verse 5, "And a stranger they will not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers." Jesus said, "My sheep know my voice." I've often referenced that when I first got to CCC, if I would have called you on the phone and said, "Hello," and you'd say, "Hello, who is this?" I think now if I call and say hello, people are going to go, "Hey, Pastor, how you doing? You've heard my voice." Are we connecting with God in such a way as our shepherd, both in comfort and in discipline, to know his voice? There are going to be some questions about knowing the voice of God, seeing him as shepherd and provider. Glad you're at Life Group today, wherever you're having this. I pray you're blessed. I love you. And I hope you get to know him more and more, as I desire more and more to know him both as shepherd in comfort and discipline, and Jehovah Jireh, my provider. Grace and peace on you.